Hello, I'm Jack Jellies and I'm an amateur jeweler. I like to do engraving and fabrication. So I thought I'd put together a brief, well not so brief, YouTube video on my process for building lockets. Now, I had in the past made lockets the conventional way and used doming tools and things like that, but with the hydraulic press, that has opened up a lot of possibilities for design. And so I want to share with you the way I've put together lockets, sterling silver lockets, using the hydraulic press. For the example today, I'll be using this Celtic zoomorphic design. It's highly stylized peacocks after some drawings in the Book of Kells, but I'm pretty sure this is a modern design. And I'll show you how I put this locket together and fabricate it and finish it. It's a very, very pretty design here. So I hope you enjoy this, and remember, it's a video, so you can always just fast forward if I'm going too slow. Thanks a lot. So lockets are one of those pieces of jewelry that has been around for a very long time. Excuse me, and it remains popular. Lockets really remain popular. I think partly it's because people like to customize things, and a locket allows you to put pictures or things of meaning for you into it and wear it. And it keeps mementos and things. So these are pretty classical, commercially available, very inexpensive lockets. You know, there's nothing wrong with them. I bought them thinking I might engrave them, but frankly, I have never used them. They're pretty slick. They're very lightweight. They're steel, and they have a way to put a picture in there, and a nice sort of snap. Because they're steel, they can be very tough. But notice, you know, the ring here is punched out. It's very thin. It's very lightweight. You know, there's nothing wrong with these at all, except that it's not my vibe. So I decided not to use this kind of finding. Instead, when I was engraving, and I still like to engrave lockets, I like to engrave lots of things, but the engraving process is so intensive that you want a quality product to begin with. And so I typically will purchase findings. So these are pre-made lockets. They're handmade, but they're pre-made. And they're nice, heavy sterling silver with an opening, and they close it nicely, and they've got a ring. And so anyway, these are actually quite nice. The size is good. And I can add custom engraving to them, and that adds an enormous amount of value to those, right? So there's a couple reasons, though, why I wanted to begin making my own lockets. One of them, not the only one, but one of them was these are getting quite expensive. So I like to be able to offer things for a couple $100s or less, and that becomes increasingly difficult to justify when you're paying a lot for the raw materials and the findings that go into it. So that's one aspect. It's not the only one. It's not the biggest one even. The other thing I wanted to do was I like challenging myself, and so I just wanted to be able to make these. That's how I practice and learn. So I wanted to be able to make my own lockets. Now, it's relatively straightforward to make a locket, and lots of people do it. So many of the things I'm going to mention today in this video, you know, I'm not reinventing the wheel here. About 80% of what I'm going to do has been done by many others many times. My go-to resources for techniques dates to before the age of the internet and YouTube, of course. So one of my favorite books on techniques is the Revere book, and yeah, this is an outstanding book. It's not cheap, but of course, if you're investing in your education, that's not a bad thing at all to have. And Revere has a couple of really interesting ways of approaching lockets and the components. The other thing I recommend is obviously the Complete Metalsmith. This was the way I actually got started in my self-education. And Tim McCreight has an enormous amount of really wonderful information to share with people. So part of what I'm going to do is use techniques that are really well known and available to many people, and you can find YouTubes that will talk about various aspects of them. But here's one thing I encountered. In addition to engraving, I wanted to make use of my increasingly diverse and large library of vintage die designs. And so some of these designs are just absolutely stellar and striking. So this is an Art Nouveau female portrait that I made into a locket. And, in order to do that, the classical way of putting together a simple locket is to punch discs of metal and then use a doming block and make sort of, domed bits, and that's how you start. Now, the difficulty of using that technique and trying to incorporate your die or any design is that it's simply, if you try to dome this after you've pressed the design, you're going to destroy the design. And that's obviously not very good. So I had to come up with something different just to handle that. Turns out that many of the dies are actually old-fashioned lockets. And so this is an example of one that was intended as a locket. And you can tell it's a very domed shape, and that's great. So this one is relatively easy to turn into a locket from a die because when you press it, you'll have the shape. Now, of course, the backside or the downside of that is you still have to have a back for this. And you can, again, match this by doming a piece of metal or a disc of metal, but that actually gives you something that isn't quite the right shape. And I've used this technique for making lockets like that as well. So lockets like this then turn out looking really nice, and they're custom made, and they fit well, backs and fronts. They have my standard sort of handmade little dings and things that I don't perfect the finish. I don't do that intentionally, but that's just the way it happens for me. But these make absolutely beautiful lockets. And so the ability to use these vintage designs to make lockets and to have the flexibility to make any shape and any size you want is what I'm aiming at. So I think what I will do for this first one is maybe I try to make a locket out of this design. So this is an example of a modern Celtic peacock design, and it is a pretty standard, exactly 1 inch in diameter, which makes it a little more straightforward. Turns out that many of my dies that I like to make into things are like 1 1/16 of an inch, which adds a little bit of a complication I can talk about later. But it's not bad. But I'm going to try and make a locket out of this. Now notice it's flat. So, I'm going to press it, then I'm going to dome it without damaging the pressing design, and then I'll make a matching back, and the rest of the assembly of the locket is very comparable to the techniques that are available online and elsewhere. I'll just show you how I do it. Okay, so I start the project with sheet, and this is silver that I cast and then rolled the ingots and then gauged it so that I know exactly what I'm working with. And it's been annealed. So I have 2 pieces of square-ish stock that's 20 gauge, and this will form both the front and the back of the locket. And then I've punched out a couple of discs of 24 gauge, and these discs I've made at 1 1/8 inches in diameter because the diameter of the locket is 1. And so I want these to overlap a little bit. These are going to become the bearing plates for the locket. So this is how I begin. First step now then is going to be to take one of these pieces of 20 gauge and make a standard sort of impression in it. So this is going to be using a piece of this to press it in the hydraulic press to get the initial design. Okay, now really shallow designs like this one, the Celtic Peacocks, and there's a couple of others that are really shallow. They're beautiful though, and in some ways they're easy to press, and in some ways they're harder, because they're so shallow, it can be difficult once you press them. Even if you trimmed well, if you remove that to re-anneal it, it will be a challenge to re-index things so that you can press it again and not goof everything up. One way around that is to drill or use a bit to gouge out a couple of random holes near the margin that serve as indexing pins. But typically for something like this, if it's like this, I probably don't need to do that. But let me show you how I go about doing that, so that I want to press it with one annealing cycle. It's a problem though, because I'm also not trimming the metal. I want to have a piece of metal that has an edge on it. If I trimmed it at all, I would make it like 1 1/4 inches, which would still be pretty large. So rather than take that labor, I'm just going to use this squarish piece of metal, and we'll see if we can't get a very nice impression. So to begin it, we'll use urethane, and we'll press it a couple times with urethane. And again, I'm using a piece of urethane that's been goobered up quite a bit. Try to get it more or less centered on the design. You're kind of guessing, and then obviously center your work as perfectly as you can get away with. And then once you've started pressing, you're committed. Okay, so we'll just send this one home. Okay, so now we've started. I'm going to turn it, rotate it a little bit, and press it again. Be sure you lower your press substantially so that when you move this, you don't jiggle the urethane and move your piece. All right, then do it again. I'm going to do this like 4 or 5 times. I like to do this because even though the upper and lower platens, when they come together, they're self-leveling, there's going to be a little bit of a variation in the way that this presses across a surface. Okay. Alrighty, now this may have done a good enough job, but I'm not going to risk it, right? So what I recommend doing then is, before you even remove that, cut either a piece of cardboard exactly that diameter and use that as a force to press this in. I can tell by feeling it, it has pressed a lot, and it may be okay. But once I remove it, I'm stuck. So I'm going to press it a couple more times, either with cardboard. You can also use aluminum foil that you sort of fold over many times and cut to size like a disc. Or if you're like me, I over the years, I buy all sorts of random stuff, and you can on eBay find like 5 pounds of scrap steel and scrap aluminum and scrap copper. So I have a whole bunch of these punched out discs of aluminum that's fairly soft. It's annealed already, and some of them, if the size works out, they just work perfectly. So I'm just going to start with putting one of those little 1-inch discs in there, and use it as a force to continue pressing, which will help define that design. So you can tell that it is picking up some of the design. So that's a good sign. Okay, now I'm going to take a look and hopefully be happy with the impression. Let's find out. This is, even though it's shallow, it is stuck, which means it probably did a good impression. There, it popped out. Oh yeah, quite nice. Okay, so for doing this with one annealing cycle, that turns out really, really well. So my next step is going to be to re-anneal this, and then I'm going to dome it a little bit so that I can add some volume to this front piece and turn it into a functional locket in an easy way. Okay, next step. So I was inspired by Kevin Potter. He was talking about using discs and spacers to draw metal into a three-dimensional form, like a shallow bowl or a cup or something like that. And I decided that technique would be great if I miniaturized it and used it for this. So what I'm going to do is, you can make these yourself. However, turns out you can buy steel. They look like washers. They're called machine bearings, and they're about 14 gauge or so. There's a little variation there, and they come in standard diameters. And so what I did was I laid in several of the 7/8 and the 1s and the 1 1/8 and 1 1/4 and a couple of 1 1/2 just to have. Now it turns out that, like I said, a couple of my really nice dies that I like to use are actually 1 1/16, and you can use 1 1/8, but it's kind of a pain. So what I did was I put one of the 1-inch ones on my lathe, and I machined it to a 1 1/16 diameter, and that works really well. Or you could use a file and do the same thing. But if you can use the standard diameters, that makes it all the more easy. I may do another video with a different way of approaching this, because you could also make lockets out of things that are not regular circles, and ovals and squares and rectangles. And to do that, I think what I'll be doing is essentially the same technique, but I will cut a profile into a very shallow piece of steel, like a 14 gauge to 12 gauge piece of steel, and make a shallow silhouette die and use it to do the same thing. Okay, so let me show you what I do here. Hopefully it will work. This 1-inch bushing will fit really well on that design. So I'm going to center this on a piece of urethane, and there's just enough of the design in the pressing that I can see where to put that. Now, this this thickness could be fine for the back, but it's a little shallow, so I'm going to add another washer on top of it. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it should be close, and that just adds volume, so that when I press this, the design, I'm not necessarily pressing the design up against the steel pusher here, and that will help keep it from being deformed. Now, the only real tricky part to doing this is, like with most silhouette dies, it's really easy to go too far. So I'm going to just do a couple of small steps here for starters. Well, hopefully you guessed it. How am I going to make the back? Pretty much exactly the same way. And now when I use the same 1-inch diameter washers or bushings, it will be very close then to the profile for the front. And it's just really helpful to start that way, because then it's less filing and goofing around with things. So I'll try to center that a little better. Does it matter what kind of urethane you have? Not really. Just get a chunk that's larger than your pieces that you're pressing. So let's try this again. Yeah, that worked out pretty well. And then, of course, if you wanted a flattish profile here, which can be easier to engrave, for example, you just use one washer and you send it home. And you have to be careful. It's a little harder to extract from the bushing, but that's not that difficult to do. And that's how I like to do round and ovals that I'm going to have a flat surface to engrave on. So once again, now this is ready to be cut out with the saw, and then I'll be soldering the bearing plates to both the front and the back. So now it's just a simple matter of saw work to free these up. One thing I forgot to do on this, on the back, I often will put my signature and the quality stamp on the flat stock before I dome it. That works out really well, and it keeps me from needing to do it after. I forgot that. So what I'll do is use a piece of one of my dapping punches and as a stake, put that in the vise, and I'll do that after the fact. So it's not a big deal. It can be done easily, but it's a step that I forgot to do on this one, and I would have preferred to have done that. So now I just simply saw these out. I'm leaving quite a... I can trim that a little better, but I do like to leave some so that I can file to the edge I want. Come on. Bearing plates are really just washers made out of sterling, and if you wanted to and you had the ability, you could probably just use a disc cutter. I don't have a centering device on my disc cutter, so it's not that much of a problem to simply scribe a line, and then I'll cut them out with my magic saw. Okay, so what I've done is these are 1 1/8. These are 1, and so that's going to leave about a 1/16 all the way around that I can use to solder on. So in order to have a little bit of a lip, I just use about a 3/16 here right now, and that gives me not quite an eighth, about 1/8 of an inch of a lip on the inside. Okay, so then I'll just be drilling these because I'm going to be piercing them. There's one, and there's... Okay. And since it's 24 gauge silver, I'm using a 6/0 6/0 blade. You could do a 5. Anything other than that on this really thin metal actually is more of a problem than it's worth. They just don't have enough teeth on the metal. So you just saw this out. Okie dokie. Well, there's one. And of course I'll finish that with a half round file and probably a silicone disc to polish that inside edge. But that's all that is. So next, I'll do the next one. Now what I'm doing is simply using hard solder to attach those tops and bottoms together to the bearing plate. So I'll flux the bearing plate pretty well. I'm just using borax and water. That's my go-to. So I put that on there, and then let's do the back first, just for grins. And again, since I've made these concentric, then I just eyeball it there and have a consistent ridge. and that way the opening will be approximately centered. And for as many operations as you can get away with, use hard solder, because it'll look better, holds better. I mean, even if I'm going to oxidize, I still try to use hard solder just because it's a better habit to be in too for fabrication, I think. And so now I'm just going to begin putting little blobs of solder on there and seeing if I can't get these fixed together. So getting the first one is the most critical. It and try to center it. Give it a try. That was a good one. Let's try another one. Obliterate your design if you're not careful by feeding solder onto it. Okay, so pickle those, trim them, and next step will be coming up. Well, this edge is about 1 millimeter to 1.5 millimeters, and I could grind it, I would, but if it's about 1 millimeter, I kind of like to, well, I'll do it this way. I kind of like to use the saw just to minimize the real fine stuff. Whoops, broke the blade. The next operations, what we're going to want to do is decide on the orientation of our piece and where we're going to want the hinge and the top. So I like to take a look at the design, and if it's possible, I like my signature and the quality mark to be sort of up and down, so that the top here would be where the jump ring is. So I'm going to do this. This is a sort of a triangular profile, so I'm going to aim for having the jump ring right there where those two wings or bits join, and that means I would need to put my back on about like that. And I just eyeball it, so it may not be perfect. Okay, so then here's one of the things that I have decided I'm going to be doing routinely. I cheat, and I'm going to use some super glue here for the next operations. So what I'll do is, keeping the orientation like that, I'm going to put some super glue on this piece, and what this will do, of course, is hold the two sides together, at least somewhat. So I'm just spreading this around. And then I'm going to line that up. Make sure it's where I want it. Give it a good squeeze. And again, it does not set up instantly, but it's pretty quick. And I'm going to leave that for about 5 minutes. And then we're going to take it to the next step. Alrighty, so the biggest thing about doing the hinge, I think, is preparing it. So this is going to be my jump ring right there. I'm going to want the hinge on this, what is the right side as it's facing out if it's hanging down. So there's my signature. And so what I'm going to do is I need to file a relatively flat spot on both sides there, and that's going to accept the knuckles for the hinge pin, or for the hinge. Now, you can of course file that. It's really easy to file, but it takes a little while. I'll finish it with a file, but I'm going to use this little belt sander here. It gets hotter than dickens, so I don't like to use it a lot, but I can orient this like this and just, again, eyeball it and try to get a more or less horizontal cut on this. Okay, that's getting there, and that's about where I'll take it, and then I'll do a little hand filing to finish that off. And then what we'll do is we will put a very small sort of curved profile in there to accept the hinge knuckles. Some people recommend that you would do it at least half the depth of the thickness of the tubing, and I tend to not go that far, just enough to allow it to seat and have a good grip for the solder. Okay, so what I did was I just filed it down a little more, and I used the edge of a triangular file to put a little groove in there. And you can do this all by hand filing fairly easily, or if you're a lazy guy like me, I chuck a very fine round file into my drill press, and I'll use that to begin at least to set this groove. Notice I'm holding it so that when it gets away from me, it goes to the back, not the design. Now we're ready to start soldering the hinge pin. Well, not the pin, the knuckles. Well, the initial step takes a bit of fiddling, but it's worth doing. First of all, when you torch this, obviously the super glue is going to burn off, and I shouldn't have to say so, but please remember that whenever you're soldering, you're going to have fumes of stuff, and you should be in a well-ventilated area or some place where you have fume extraction. A little bit of super glue, frankly, doesn't add that much noxious to the mix, but you need to be aware of it. It also is good because it helps a little bit to keep the solder from flowing into the bearing plate. So what I've done is I've simply wrapped iron wire in opposing directions, and then I am going to solder first a continuous piece of thick-walled tubing so that the whole piece is soldered to the back. For making hinges, frankly, there are dozens of ways. People that do this routinely do it easily and well. Revere suggests sort of notching in the middle so that there's no contact there. I'm just going to do it this way and then saw the middle out. That'll leave me with two side knuckles that are attached to the back, and then we'll cut a piece to fit into the front and the middle knuckle. Okay, so first step is to put a little flux on this part of the join, and then I'll ball up a little hard solder, and we'll see if we can get it fixed. Okay. Whoops, see, that moved even with the wire. But right now it's okay, so I'm just going to try it. Oops. Okay. I like to, for things like this, if they're fiddly, I use the little butane torch to place my solder. Okay. Again, I never get used to it, but the iron wire deforms when you heat it and can move on you a little bit. But I like to use it rather than anything else because it just holds the piece more or less in one place. Now I'm just going to drop that into some water to quench it, and we'll pull these wires off and see what the result was. If I have to, I'll use a razor and open this up, because a lot of times it's very common to get a little, even if you've put yellow ochre on there and you've been really careful, it's very possible to get a tiny bit of solder wicking in, and it just means that you open it up very carefully, and sometimes I need to use a very fine saw blade to cut that. So let's try to see if we can figure out what's going on here. Okay, so I got it opened up. It definitely has just a little bit of an attachment I would rather it not have. So the first thing I'm going to do is very carefully run my saw blade along the off side here, just to make sure that by that yellow ochre we didn't get any solder in the edge. Okay. And still have a little water there, so let me wipe that off. Okay, and then what we'll do is we'll put the fine saw blade down like this and simply run it a little bit. Don't overdo it. And then we'll see if that has begun to weaken wherever oh yeah. So now if I look carefully, yeah, I just had a tiny bit of solder wick in. That's actually not so bad. You'd rather not have any, and about 50% of the time it works perfectly for me. And about 50% of the time I have to do something like this. But yeah, that's part of the fun. I guess, I'll get better at this. With hinges, I think it's a matter of you have to do, if you do 20 or 30 or 100, you probably are in much better shape. Yeah, okay, so there was just a tiniest bit of solder that wicked across where I probably missed either having some super glue or yellow ochre. Okay, so now I'm going to simply use a file to clean up these edges, and then what we will do is we will cut out the area where the middle knuckle is going to go. Radio. I've got this more or less fitted. At this stage, again, I won't pickle it just yet because I have another major soldering operation to do. What you want to do now is just make sure that when you place the other side, you're going to be able to, in all likelihood, be able to put solder on that middle portion and have it affixed to the front. If you need to do some adjusting, now is the time to do it. And if you needed to make these closer together, what I would do is file a little more, like I did here, on these two corners, which is where those knuckles are going to be. And that will help this middle part go in. And then if you're off by 0.5 millimeter, or in this case, 1/100th, like 100 microns, you can just easily file that or sand it off later. Okay, so, whoops. Next step, you decide how big your middle knuckle is, and I had seen a recommendation to make the middle knuckle larger than the two side knuckles, which makes sense to me. I don't always do it, but if I can, I do. Actually, so before I do that, I forgot. I need to trim the ends because I did not intentionally make this the right size. I always make this initial knuckle, a little oversized. So what I want to do is, I also like to put just a tiny angle on that. I can file more later. But in order to find the center, or to even guess at the center, I need to have these cut. Okay, so let's do that. Yeah, it was pretty close, but not right on. Okay, now I'm ready to mark the center knuckle. Okay, so you can measure it if you want, or of course you can do it my lazy way and eyeball it, because I'm going to be fitting the middle knuckle anyway. But you can get it awfully close. Alrighty, so then it's a matter of carefully setting the initial cuts, and then what I'm going to do is cut all the way to that flat spot that I've already filed onto the locket. And again, you want to be careful not to go too far. In fact, you're better off underdoing just a little bit, because you can always file off the excess. But it's a little more difficult to repair if you gouge the locket. Okay, so now what I need to do is simply turn the saw, like I was doing a cut, and cut this middle knuckle away. I'm going to probably waste this piece and use a new piece of tubing. So that's one reason why I think professionals would probably do 3 knuckles and not do it this way. But for me, I don't know, it's not like I make thousands of lockets. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do, this is where I might snap the blade, but carefully turn the saw. There. Actually quite nice. And now I'll use a file to clean that up. Make it nice and straight and smooth. And well, these 2 side knuckles are in pretty good shape. So now I'm going to fit the middle knuckle. I take my tubing, line it up, and put a mark where I want to cut it. And I'll cut it very, very close, but have just a fraction available to use the file on, so I can make it more square. Okay, so then we're just going to cut that middle knuckle out. Again, just let the weight of the saw do this. I'm not pulling down at all. And I wouldn't put my finger in the way of the blade if I wasn't just being very gentle. See, I want to catch that. There we go. And I like to, for these knuckles, I like to saw the way through just because otherwise you wind up with a little nub there that you have to file off anyway, and that makes it a little harder. Okay, so let's do a quick fitting. If I'm lucky, this will fit, but probably not. Nope. As I expect, I need to file a little bit. Now, for such fine pieces of tubing, there are all sorts of jigs to use. And I do use them on occasion, but a lot of times it's easier just to hold it with a pair of tweezers, thin tweezers, or a needle or something, and use that to stabilize the piece while you file these edges flat. So I'll turn it around and hold it again and do the other side. Okay, so let's see what we've got now. Perfect. Well, not perfect, but hopefully you know what I mean. It's sometimes just easier to use something like this straight pin. There. Because I like it to be just fitting a little bit loose so that I can wiggle this middle knuckle over just a titch if I need to. Okay, because what I'm going to do before I solder this is I'm going to paint a little ochre on this portion because I want the solder to adhere really only to the front piece and that middle knuckle, right? And so I'm going to be very carefully placing a tiny dollop of solder right there, and I'll put some ochre on this back part before we do that operation just to see if I can minimize the chance of having the solder flow there. Okay, so that's what's going to happen next. Okay, the the yellow ochre has dried. So what I'll do now is pin them together. Shell together. Line them up nicely. And if I was smart, I saved my wire. Set it there on the block. Don't go crazy with the flux because you don't want to dissolve that yellow ochre that's on the other side. Okay. And now I'll place that small pellion of solder there. And I may have to do a little more solder than this, but I'd rather start with something a little less. Okay, try to make sure that the bit of solder is touching both the tube and the front face. And this is where, if it works, that's great. If not, I might have to add a little more solder. Remember you've got a lot of mass in this Locket part, so you want to heat this bulk pretty good here, and then hit the hinge. I'm watching to see when that solder starts to become a little liquidy. There it goes. Let's see if I did it. I think I probably did. So we'll just go with this. Let's try it and see, because if I did it, then I'm not going to add more solder and risk welding these two together very solidly. So I'll just quench that. Let's pull the wire off. We'll leave the pin in there for a second. Let's see if we can separate these. Nope. So, as I expected. Damn it. Oh, no, I did it. Okay. Actually, it worked pretty well. Let's double check here. Yep. I did it. Alrighty. I'm always surprised. But it worked. Just a teeny bit of file work to do. That's why it was sticking just a bit. I need to trim just a little bit more off these corners as it opens. It's a little awkward, okay, but that's actually not bad at all. So there you see what I've done is made a hinge that holds these pretty well together. When I put an actual hinge pin in there, it will fit very snugly, and we will rivet that in. Okay, but for the first part, I'm going to go ahead and do just a little cleanup and file work on this after I pickle it. And yeah, we're getting there. That's pretty cool. Okay, so let's take this needle out, that pin out, and there we have it. Now, whilst we are waiting for that piece to pickle, let's go ahead and make a bale. I'll be making two bales. This one is the one I'll use for the Celtic locket, and I haven't put any on film, but I'm going to make a bramble bale for another locket that I'm doing in parallel that I just haven't videotaped. So first thing I'm going to do is just put a piece of scrap sterling that's been annealed on top of that, put a piece of aluminum on top of this and press it, and then we'll cut it out. Okay, let's see if I can get this pressed. Now let's see what we did. Okay, there comes the piece of aluminum. Yep, perfect. Okay, so next step is we'll take this over to the bench and cut it out. Okay, you don't have to do it this way, but I like to do it this way. Is I will first just get a little side trim here, because this is pretty thin metal. I'll be cutting it more anyway. Okay, then I'll put it in my bench pin, and you'll be able to see it better. Okay, there's one part, and then I'll leave a little bit there. And by doing this, I can use a file and round these ends and use them like a ring or a tab to go through the jump ring. Makes it a lot easier to solder these on. Okay, now a little bit more on this side. Righty, so before I rivet the hinge pin, I'm going to do a little bit of preparation. I'm going to put a little divot in the end of each of these knuckles so that it has room to expand the silver pin a little bit. And then I'll do a quick, won't be a polish, but a sort of a sanding with the discs on these to make them nice and even. And then I'll locate the jump ring and the clasp. And I like to install those before I rivet the hinge pin because they go on separate pieces. So the clasp I'll solder to the front part, and the jump ring I'll solder to the back part. Okay, so first step is I'll take a in this case I'm going to use a 2mm ball, and you could probably use a 3, and I'm just going to as carefully as I can put a little divot. Yes, that will accept the silver wire that we will then sort of pound in there and rivet that. Okay, I probably don't need to go back to the coarsest of these. I'm going to use this black rubber or black silicone wheel and see if that will take out these file marks. Okay, and we'll do the blue. So what I'll do, I'll refine these with a round file in just a bit. I'm going to want my jump ring right there on the back. So let me put a mark there. And then I'm going to want my clasp directly opposite the center knuckle. And so I'll put a mark there. Okay. Now, with either a round file or a half round, now separate your pieces. And I like to be able to put a little bit of a divot where I'm going to install the wire as a clasp. And angled is okay, just a little bit. You'll bend this pin after it's installed anyway. Okay, so that notch will locate the clasp, and then this is where I want to locate the jump ring, and that's actually seems a little off. I'm gonna go to the right of that because I'm trying to go with these hinge knuckles. I might have just gotten this titch off of my center there. I like to have a bit to have the jump ring solder to so that you have a significant amount of surface area to hold the ring. Okay, so before we rivet that pin, we will install a jump ring and an initial rough clasp. I've selected the jump ring I want to use. It'll be that, and we'll get this all set up. So first thing I'll do here is put some flux where that jump ring is going to go. And then I'll put some flux on the jump ring. Okay. And then we'll take a pallion of solder. I am using medium solder on this, and I'll go a little bigger than you might think, just because I'd rather file off a little bit and have a nice secure join in this case, because that's of course the mechanical holding of the entire piece. So first get solder onto the jump ring. There we go. Very nice. That looks pretty good. Okay, so this one, yes, he will file off on this side. This will go into the pickle, and then for the pin, I'm using 16 gauge wire, and again I'll solder this little divot, and we'll put this upside down like that. I'll hold a little piece of wire in some forceps, dip it in flux, put a piece of, again, that's too big. Those are too small. Looking for a Goldilocks. Italian, I don't really have one. This isn't bad. Okay, and start my torch. Put the solder onto the piece of wire, and then there. Solder that to the front piece, and then we'll be filing that to fit. But that's how I make the clasp. Okay, so to fit this tubing, a nice stiff piece of 18 gauge wire works well. I use 16 for the clasp, and let's see if we can feed an 18 in for this hinge pin. It should fit quite tightly. I may need to ream those holes just a bit. Yeah, I think I'm going to ream them just a teeny bit. To do that, I use one of my long flame tip burrs. These are these are 1 millimeter in diameter. Okay, let's see if that did the trick. It should have. Sometimes when I don't saw the wire, I nip it, and by nipping it, even if it looks straight, it oftentimes is a little bit compressed, yeah, and hard to get in. There we go. Yep. Now you want it to fit very snugly, and I'm going to want about 1 millimeter coming out of each end. Okay, so what I'll do now is simply use my saw and cut. We'll cut this one about there. This one is pretty close, but I'm going to trim it just a little bit. Okay. And then what we're going to do, I put some tape on there just to protect them. Use my hammer and try to set these, set the ends of this pin. Notice I trimmed the clasp just a little bit, and I actually bent it out a touch because I don't want it tight when I'm setting this hinge pin. Okay, typically to set these pins, I'll use my little goldsmith hammer and try to tap on either end. Whoops. Yeah, so this is a little big, but that's okay. It'll be okay. I can file off some of that extra. But that's going to tighten this hinge considerably. Yeah, I'm afraid. Yep, it deformed a little bit. I'm going to have to tighten that up, polish it some. But that's not too shabby. So what let's do is, I think that works pretty well. So now I'm going to, yeah, that's working very well. I'll file these a little bit just to clean them up. Then I'm going to put a notch in the edge here for a fingernail before I tighten this clasp. And to do the clasp, I will put just a little bit of a just a little bit of a depression right here, and then I'll bend the clasp over and just fiddle with it until I get a nice tight snick, when it closes. Then I'll attach the bale, and we're ready to put it in the pin polisher. Yeah, so that's actually looking quite passable, I think. Well, all I did was clean up a little bit around the hinge pins to make sure that's nice, and then now it's time to work on this clasp a little bit. So all I'll do is protect the face with my finger and file down this bit of overhang. I want to locate the pin, the jump ring, just a bit. Yeah, that's okay. Alrighty. There we go. So now, take a pair of needle nose pliers and squeeze this pin and bend it a little bit over this way and test. That's nice and snug. So that's really close on the back side to catch it. And then just a little bit in here to give it a little indentation. Okay, let's try it. Oh, that's exactly what I want. And pin polish it. Let me see if I can get it apart. Yeah. Okay, yeah, I like that. That's looking pretty nice. Almost there. Well, here's the Celtic locket we've been working on, and another locket that I was working on in parallel. And so we're going to be just putting them into the pin polisher with some Shine Bright. And I like to start these at least open so that the pins have a chance to pound around on the inside. You got to be careful then and remove all the pins. But we'll put that on the shaker and set it for about a half an hour.